Hello and welcome to Since Attlee and Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each episode, we will be chewing over delightful historical morsels of British political history.
This is our last regular episode of 2025, as next week we're starting a new mini-series on the Heath versus Wilson elections. That will take us from 1966 through to the two elections of 1974. So make sure you're following or subscribed to get notifications of new podcasts wherever you get this podcast from, so that you know when that comes out in the following weeks. But this week, we're talking about what I really think is one of the most remarkable series of events in 21st century British politics, certainly. It's a story of how a man who had never before been on the front bench of politics for his own party, in spite of the fact he'd been an MP for more than 3 decades, suddenly being catapulted into the most senior position of responsibility within Labour, the leader. Of course, we're talking about Jeremy Corbyn and the remarkable series of events that led to him becoming leader of the Labour Party in 2015. So, Richard, I think to really understand how Jeremy Corbyn rises to the top of Labour, there are a few things that happened in the preceding years that we really need to understand. One of them, I think, is what is the mood like within Labour, and what is the position of MPs and the membership and people who support the party further afield about its own record in office from 1997 to 2010, and then how Ed Miliband leads the party in opposition from 2010 to 2015. So what are the key themes that really emerge in Labour's reckoning about its own record in office and then its time in opposition from 2010 to 15?
Yeah, so I think absolutely crucial to understanding how Jeremy Corbyn got elected in 2015 is to understand the circumstances that led to Ed Miliband's election in 2010. So the Labour Party from 1981 until 2010 had a leadership election process called the Electoral College. And the Electoral College created a weighted voting system for different classes of voters. So one class was the MPs, another were ordinary Labour members, and another class were what they called the affiliates. And these were people who were members of affiliated trade unions to the Labour Party, and also what were called socialist societies like the Fabian Society, the Cooperative Party, Labour Students, LGBT Labour, and so on. And by 2010, each of these groups had 1/3 of the weighted vote. So obviously in proportional terms, that gave MPs a very significant influence, but not as significant an influence as they had had before 1981, where the leader was elected only by the members of the Parliamentary Labour Party, by the Labour MPs in particular. And so in 2010, after Labour loses that election, Gordon Brown resigns and there's a Labour leadership contest. The contest is primarily fought between the two Miliband brothers, David Miliband and Ed Miliband. There are other candidates who stand. Andy Burnham, obviously still someone very much in the news at the moment as the Mayor of Manchester. Ed Balls, who now is the host of a rival podcast. And Diane Abbott, who remains a Labour MP. She is now the longest serving female member of the House of Commons and of course was the first black woman MP and someone very much from the left of the Labour Party. But really the contest was between the two Miliband brothers. And we've done an episode on that contest, so I don't need to go into the details of that. But what's relevant for our purposes is that the outcome of that contest exposes some of the oddities of the Electoral College process. So in the end, David Miliband won 53.4% of the MP's votes. This is after votes have been transferred. So you go through different rounds of transferring votes. And so the last round is Ed versus David Miliband. So David wins 53% of the MPs. He wins 54% of the members, but he only wins 40% of the affiliated voters, the members primarily of trade unions who vote in that contest. And so Ed Miliband's lopsided support among the Labour-affiliated union vote gives him the leadership in spite of not winning majorities among ordinary Labour members and among MPs. And this, I think, is really important because it creates a sense that Ed Miliband has come to the leadership through illegitimate means. And this is partly, there's this media story first, that of course he stood against his own brother, which for some people seems very strange thing to do, that the brothers couldn't work it out between them. But secondly, there's this idea that Miliband is Red Ed, he's the choice of the unions and not the choice of either the MPs or the ordinary membership. And Ed is a candidate who positions himself as sort of the post-New Labour candidate, whereas David was seen more as a candidate of kind of continuity New Labour.
It was a really interesting time. I remember listening on the radio to the announcement of the new Labour leader back in 2010. And certainly as somebody who was involved in the Conservatives at the time, I was delighted when it was Ed Miliband. I actually think that was somewhat misplaced with hindsight. I think Ed Miliband is a more skilled and talented politician than he got credit for at the time, or really in the years since. I mean, just to compare the two brothers now, one of them stropped off to New York just a few years after losing the leadership, and there's not really a big voice anymore in British or international politics. And Ed Miliband, of course, is in the cabinet, and depending on what you think, is either leading us to a new, radical, progressive energy policy, or is destroying British energy policy. But nobody can doubt that Ed Miliband, 15 years on from when he became Labour leader, is still having a very big impact in British politics, and may even come to have a bigger impact in the years ahead.
I think the right of the Labour Party misread or misinterpreted these results. So they looked at these results and they thought, okay, the danger from the perspective of the right of the Labour Party comes out of the unions, and the members and the MPs are sensible. In fact, the members gave a higher share of the vote to David than even the MPs did, right? David got 54% of the member vote and 53% of the MP vote. What I would say, though, is that I think that the membership's vote for David was not necessarily an indication that the membership wanted continuity, New Labour. There was some survey research done of Labour Party members in 2010, and they were asked to place themselves on a left to right spectrum and to place other figures in the Labour Party on a left to right spectrum. And interestingly, Labour members placed themselves further to the left than either their placement of David or Ed. And so you might think, well, why would members not vote for Ed then if they felt they were more ideologically proximate to Ed than to David? And I think you have to put yourself back in the mindset of that time. And I can use myself as an example that I voted in that leadership contest. My first preference choice was for Diane Abbott, actually. But my second choice preference was for David Miliband. And so ultimately, my vote in the final round, that 54%, went to David over Ed. And the reason that I made that vote was because it had been drilled into me that the Labour Party needed to be a party of the centre ground in order to win elections. And so even though my heart was much more on the economic left of New Labour, my head, based on what I had been told, was that the party needed to be much more in the centre. And so I thought, well, I'll vote heart for preference 1. I'll vote for Diane, who still has my heart. And I'll vote head for preference 2, which is for David. And I think the 2010s saw a change in the kind of conventional wisdom among Labour members about what was actually a winning election programme. And the 2015 election defeat became a way of teaching the Labour members that actually just sort of taking a cautious approach doesn't necessarily mean that you win an election, but we'll probably come on to that in a little bit.
I want to come on to what changes between 2010 and 2015, because there were several things that change, which on the face of it are of enormous significance. And I think we should look at what they are and then look at quite how significant they ultimately proved to be. One of them is a change really in the relationship that some supporters can have with the Labour Party. When we tend to think about our relationship as individuals to political parties, there are all sorts of ways in which that relationship can manifest itself. Some people are just occasional voters and part-time supporters of certain parties. Some people are very reliable voters for a party and form part of the core vote. There are people, of course, who choose to be members of a political party. And then within that cohort, there are people who choose to give up their time or their money to give extra levels of support to a political party, delivering leaflets, knocking on doors, going to fundraising events, and so on. And there are also then, further up the scale, elected representatives and ultimately MPs and people who work for the party and so on. And we usually see the big divide, really the tipping point within this scale of engagement within a political party, as being between those who vote for it but play no role in its internal affairs, and those who join as members, and so are entitled to take part in local meetings, to select candidates, and so on, to send representations to a party conference and all the rest of it. That's where the in the party or out of the party distinction has tended to fall. But after 2010, when Ed Miliband is elected, a new type of relationship between supporter and party was created. This is the role of the registered supporter, a form of non-member, but who has powers within the party. So what can you tell us about how that came about?
Yeah, so I think we also have to remember the context, the international context of the time, 2010, 2011. At this time, Barack Obama is president of the United States. He's just won this impressive victory in the 2008 presidential election. And there are many people in Labour, as is often the case, where people look to one international example and say, wow, the left is ascendant in America. Let us learn from the Americans. And so at this time, there were efforts made by people in the kind of in Labour officialdom, people who worked for the Labour Party and around Ed Miliband's team, where they said, we must learn from what Barack Obama did. And they then paid, probably at great expense, for American political consultants to come over to Britain and to teach the Labour Party about how to win elections in Britain based on what worked in America. Obviously, a very flawed set of assumptions, but that is sadly quite often the mindset among certain elements of our political class. And so people said, well, Barack Obama was a community organizer. It goes back to his days when he had left Columbia before he went to Harvard Law School, and he spent a series of kind of gap years working on the south side of Chicago, which he had no personal connection to, and it was kind of learning how to do street level politics. And so they said, all right, we need to do community organizing. So there was this whole kind of effort to set up a community organizing element within Labour. David Miliband was tasked by his brother with leading that. That went nowhere. That all fizzled out. And the second thing these organizers said from America was, you do party membership in a different way than in the US. In the US, if you're a Democrat, you don't pay an annual subscription to be a member of the Democratic Party. You don't get a membership card. You don't get anything like that. You just register as a supporter of the party when you register to vote. And they said, why doesn't the Labour Party do something like that? Why don't we set up a registered supporter scheme? And at the same time, a similar type of scheme was happening in France, where the Socialist Party in France was saying, let us create a kind of primary system for electing the president of France, where all you have to do is pay a small fee and attest that you believe in the principles of socialism, and then you can vote for the person who becomes president of France. So basically both France and Britain became smitten on the left with the American system. And so in 2011, so just his first conference as Labour leader after the 2010 conference, so the first time he's had a full year in the job, Miliband releases this document of party internal reforms. It's called Refounding Labour. He makes Peter Hain the head of this project. I was a delegate at that conference in 2011. It was in Liverpool. It was my first Labour conference as a delegate. And I can remember various Labour officials were putting pressure on me, quite frankly, to vote for this package of reforms. I was taken to a reception where I was introduced to Peter Hain. I was introduced to Rachel Reeves, who was an up-and-coming, fairly new, only elected the previous year, Labour MP, and had a little chat with her where she explained to me the importance of supporting these reforms. And at the end of the evening, I thought, right, I'm definitely going to vote against these reforms. Something doesn't smell right here. And so I did, but the reforms, the persuasion tactics obviously worked quite well with other delegates, and of course, crucially with the unions, and they voted through the Refounding Labour reforms, which set up this scheme called the Registered Supporters Scheme, where you didn't have to pay full membership, but you could join but you could register your support for Labour, and that would entitle you not to the full sort of package of powers of internal selection process, but it would allow you to vote in Labour leadership elections.
It's striking, really, that for just £3, which is what you had to pay to become a registered supporter at the time, the party was basically willing to give away the biggest membership right in some respects. When you look at the ways in which members engage with political parties, well, very few go along to local constituency meetings. Very few, as a percentage of the whole membership, also go along to party conference. Very few even choose to select or to have a role in selecting who their local council candidates or parliamentary candidates are, really. But the things that always get among party members themselves very high turnout is voting on the leader. Usually in the 70s, 80s, 80% or so. So it's quite interesting that that was given away so cheaply when it is for many members, I think, the biggest right and privilege of party membership.
But of course, you have to remember at that time, this was still within the context of the Electoral College. And so these registered supporters were going to be put in the same pot as the ordinary Labour members. So they did have obviously an influence, but it was very much a capped influence.
Well, that is the other thing I want to come on to, because I think that's the other thing that changes fundamentally between 2010 and 2015, which is the very abolition of the Electoral College and the weighting of these respective elements within the Labour leadership decision. So how does that come about, and what is the immediate effect of that, or what is the rationale for that, shall we say?
Well, it all starts with a parliamentary punch-up a few months after the 2011 conference that brings in the Registered Supporters Scheme. In February of 2012, there was a Labour MP by the name of Eric Joyce. He was the MP for Falkirk in Scotland. He was an ex-military man, a man with a judo background, and also a man with a drink problem. He enters Strangers' Bar in Parliament, and he looks around and he says, there are too many effing Tories in this bar. And he's really in quite a blotto state at this point. It's about 10 o'clock at night. He's clearly been drinking for a few hours. He's allegedly swinging and singing to himself. And an MP by the name of Andrew Percy, who was a Conservative, one of those too many effing Tories in the Strangers' Bar, asks Eric Joyce if he'd mind letting him take a chair, a stool, from where Joyce was sitting, because the bar was filling up and he had some guests. He responded to that request by flipping out and headbutting another Conservative MP called Stuart Andrew. And poor old Stuart, I think, was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I'm not sure he had even said boo to a goose in this context. Well, then a Labour whip, Phil Wilson, who was the successor to Tony Blair in his seat in Sedgefield, saw what was going on and tried to contain the situation and tried to wrestle and restrain Eric Joyce. But Eric Joyce responded by forcefully striking Phil Wilson. And it wasn't until a rather formidable Conservative MP called Jackie Doyle Price, who I think came from a fairly hard-scrabble background herself, put herself between Joyce and his other Tory targets, and that sort of calmed him down enough for parliamentary security to come in, restrain him and wrestle him out of Stranger's Bar. And as he was being taken out of the bar, he lashed out again and managed to break a window. Now, you might be wondering, what the hell does this have to do with the election of Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party's internal reforms? Well, to make a long story short, what ends up happening is that Eric Joyce is deselected as a Labour MP. There is a process to select a replacement in his seat of Falkirk quite quickly. Falkirk, like many Labour constituencies, particularly in Scotland at that time, had a very low party membership. Now, registered supporters did not have a vote for the local MP. So that wasn't one of the privileges that they got. But the unions saw an opportunity to influence the process by signing up local members to join, signing up local union members to join the Labour Party. This was seen as particularly an opportunity for Unite the Union, which represented the workers in the Greymouth refinery, which was the major employer in the area. And so Unite signed up a load of its members to the Labour Party and agreed to pay the first year of their membership fees. Now, I have no problem with this. This was quite standard practice in the history of the Labour Party. Indeed, the unions used to have a much more influential role in the selection of MPs, where the unions would effectively have a block vote in the party selection processes. And you talk about MPs being sponsored MPs by a particular union that represented the major unionized workforce in the area, often a mine or a steel works or something like that. So that, Unite was doing what unions have often done in the Labour Party. That was fine. But this story of the Falkirk selection became very embarrassing for Ed Miliband. And it reinforced this image that Ed Miliband was allowing the Labour Party to be run by the unions, that he was the union man, and it reinforced this idea that Ed Miliband was in the Labour leadership through some kind of corrupt or crooked means via the unions. Now, I don't accept that. I think that's a slur. I think this is all perfectly legitimate within the democratic processes of the Labour Party. But the response of Ed Miliband and his team was not to defend the democratic processes of the Labour Party, but was to fundamentally change them.
So that then leads to something called the Collins Review. A man called Ray Collins is tasked with looking at the situation within Labour, its internal organisation, its relationship with the trade unions, and as part of that process, the method of electing the Labour leader, a process, of course, which the unions play a big role in within that affiliate section of the Electoral College, is also on the table and also up for discussion. What outcome do they conclude about how the Labour leader should be elected?
Right. There are lots of different reforms in the Collins Review. And again, this is a conference that I went to myself. I was a delegate. It was a special conference held, I believe, on the 1st of March 2014. I can remember it because it was my dad's birthday that day. And I was one of the very few delegates who actually spoke against the Collins Review. I remember going up to the rostrum to give my speech, and no one in the hall knew that I was just about to denounce it. We'd had a series of speeches all say what a wonderful thing this would be and how this was going to make Labour a more open and democratic party. And I remember walking up and I looked at the front row, and in the front row was seated the entirety of the shadow cabinet. And I can remember in particular locking eyes with Yvette Cooper, who was at the time the shadow Home Secretary. And she was smiling and nodding and clapping her hands. And I gave this speech denouncing the Collins Review, saying it was a terrible idea and that people should vote against it. And then after I gave my speech, I went back down to my seat, and I was looking at the shadow cabinet, and this time they were all sat there, stony-faced. No one was clapping. And I remember Yvette Cooper gave me a very stony glare as I walked back to my seat. The key thing for this story that the Collins Review does is it abolishes the Electoral College. And so it removes the MPs from having a protected vote share of electing Labour leaders. It doesn't actually remove the votes of affiliated union members and doesn't remove the role of registered supporters. And of course, it keeps in the role of members. So now what you have is, rather than have these kind of three weighted blocks, you've got one great big pot now, which in it sits members, registered supporters, and trade union members. And although Miliband professed this to be, or his people wanted this to be, a great punch up with the unions, and indeed actually a lot of the press presented it in that way, anyone who looked at this really with a bit more of a skeptical eye and understood something about internal processes in the Labour Party realized it was a great union victory because it lifted the cap on the union vote. And if the unions could recruit a sufficient number of members of their own members to actually turn out and vote in Labour leadership elections, they could now totally swamp the ordinary members of the party. And this registered supporter scheme, which had previously been capped in that 1/3 pot of members and registered supporters, well, now it was open season.
So it's quite interesting that what ends up happening is that the Labour Party adopts a leadership model which isn't too dissimilar, in fact, to the one that the Conservative Party has at that time. Of course, there are different elements of it. So the trade unions and affiliates isn't a factor within the Conservative Party. But it's basically a two-stage process. In the first stage, members of parliament are in the driving seat, so they don't totally lose their power. They maintain the responsibility for nominating candidates for the Labour leadership. Unlike in the Conservative Party, under these proposals within Labour, they don't then narrow it down. Their only opportunity to do quality control over who goes before the membership is whether or not they give somebody enough support at the very first stage to make it onto the ballot at all. But then after that, the election takes place on a one person, one vote, not one member, one vote, because of course there's all these non-members involved in the process. And what's remarkable about that, and has sometimes happened in the Conservative Party, even in the years leading up to this, is that it means that the newest supporter, somebody who's paid £3 to be a registered supporter only very recently, and the most long-standing member of parliament, at that stage, when they're actually getting down to brass tacks and deciding who is going to be the next Labour leader, play an equal role in the process, that all this waiting is now gone. So there is the opportunity for a couple of things to happen. One, for, like you say, the unions to play a much bigger role in the process by having many, many, many more members. There are millions of people in the country who are in trade unions. No political party has that many people in it. So affiliated unions could, if they wanted to, really flood the process if they get their own people to turn out. And then the other thing that can happen is these registered supporters can sign up en masse, pay their £3, and also flood the process. So it really is you could call it more democratic if you like, but from a party management perspective, it really is the abandonment of central control and a large part of central influence over the choice of who the next Labour leader would be. And these rules get put to the test very quickly, because in 2015, Labour loses that election. I think Ed Miliband expected to win that election, including on polling day, but instead Labour goes backwards, gets completely mullered in Scotland, which is a very big part of the story, but it also actually doesn't do very well in England against the Conservatives, who also managed to take a big chunk of Liberal Democrat constituencies as well, and David Cameron gets in with a majority government. And then on this really remarkable day in British politics, the day after the 2015 general election, there are mass resignations at the top of British politics. So the day before, of course, David Cameron was leader of the Conservative Party, Nick Clegg, leader of the Liberal Democrats, Ed Miliband, leader of Labour, and a man called Nigel Farage was leader of UKIP. The next day, Miliband, Clegg, and Farage all resign their positions. David Cameron is the last of the major leaders standing. And therefore, we're going to have a series of leadership changes. And in Labour, these rules are going to be put to the test for the very first time. So as that election begins to get underway, Richard, who is thinking and hoping to fill Ed Miliband's shoes and to take on the leadership?
Well, according to the rules, in order to stand for the leadership, you needed to secure at that time nominations from 12.5% of MPs and actually MEPs as well. Now it's 20% of MPs. Of course, there are no MEPs. So one of the things that Keir Starmer's done as leader is he raised that nomination threshold from 12.5 to 20%. And so the runners and riders were Andy Burnham, who had stood in 2010, was a candidate again in 2015, and Burnham had a remarkable transformation over those 5 years. Burnham had served as Miliband's shadow health secretary. He had, I think, performed very well in Parliament against particularly the Conservative Health Secretary Andrew Lansley, who introduced a series of far-reaching reforms to the National Health Service, which were deeply unpopular in the country and particularly in the Labour Party. And Burnham was seen as someone who spoke the sort of voice of the kind of true Labour membership, the idealism of the true Labour membership, particularly speaking about the preciousness of the NHS. And I remember I went to an event he did in Bedford, my hometown, where he supported these women who were marching from Darlington to London to save the NHS. And I got a signed T-shirt from Andy Burnham, where Burnham signed on the back of it the words of Nye Bevan, where he said the NHS will last as long as there are people with the faith to fight for it. So he was positioning himself as a sort of Bevanite candidate.
It's remarkable with Andy Burnham. Just two comments I wanted to make about him. One, that he is this very chameleon-like figure. That he starts out really in politics as being seen as an arch Blairite, and then he increasingly moves over to the left of the party. I think when he sees it as being quite useful for him to do that. He also changes in lots of other respects as well. He starts his political career as basically a professional Scouser, and now he's a professional Mancunian, now that he's Mayor of Greater Manchester, where I should declare the tiny interest I have in that. I used to live in Manchester and never once voted for Andy Burnham to be Mayor of Greater Manchester. The other thing about Andy Burnham that's really striking is that he is seriously ambitious. So, these events that we're talking about now, the 2010 leadership election is 15 years ago, and then this one is 10 years ago. And still Andy Burnham's name is in the mix as somebody who could be a future leader of the Labour Party. And nobody seems to be putting that name about as much as people around Andy Burnham. So he's a seriously ambitious man wishing to take on the Labour leadership.
Yeah, so Burnham, you're absolutely right. Burnham in 2010 had been seen as a kind of Blairite New Labour candidate. And by 2015, he was seen as the candidate of the left of the party, at least initially. We'll come to how that changes. Then the candidate who was sort of more of the kind of continuity, middle of the road candidate was Yvette Cooper, the aforementioned Shadow Home Secretary. Her husband, Ed Balls, had stood for the Labour leadership in 2010. And in effect, she was also representing that kind of part of New Labour that believed in the reforms of New Labour, but weren't Blairites. They were of that Brownite wing, so they were sort of in the middle of the party. And then you had a candidate who represented the right of the Labour Party, which was Liz Kendall, who now, of course, Cooper and Kendall serve in the Starmer government at the moment. So that was the shape of things.
A tiny observation I want to make as well, which is really quite striking actually, is that one of the things when I've been writing about Conservative leadership elections in recent years is how quite a few of the names just sort of come and go. They have these careers, they're very ambitious people, and they burn brightly for a short period of time. And a lot of them are now out of Parliament, often voluntarily, in many cases not voluntarily, but at the insistence of their constituents. But you have names where they're mooted as a future leader, and then 5, 10, 15 years on, certainly nobody really knows who they are anymore. They cease to be household names in their own house.
They were the future ones.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas these names, these are all still big names in our politics. We talked about Burnham, but of course Cooper and Kendall are still in the current cabinet. So it is quite striking how this field, there are people who are still very much active at the top of politics now. That is also true for the fourth person, of course, who is standing in this leadership election. And I think that about Jeremy Corbyn, if it wasn't for these events in 2015, all of these three other people I think we'd probably know about anyway. Now, Andy Burnham would still be a big name in Labour politics, so I think would Yvette Cooper, less so Liz Kendall, but it's not what happens in this contest that means she's in the cabinet today. It's that she's seen as being a credible sort of person within Labour who's in the right part of the party to be in Keir Starmer's government. So I think all three of these people would be known quantities in our politics today, were it not for this leadership election, or in spite of this leadership election. I don't think that's true about the fourth person, Jeremy Corbyn, where really in the public imagination, these events are the making of him.
Yes, that's right. So I think if you were to look at those three, you'd see, right, the sort of centre left, the centre and the centre right of the party are represented there. But there was an argument from those who were on the further left of the party that they should put up a candidate to represent the more ardently socialist element of the Labour Party. And this was particularly through this group of MPs called the Socialist Campaign Group. The campaign group, which had its origins in fact, in Tony Benn's challenge of Neil Kinnock for the Labour leadership back in 1988, and were the group of MPs who had been consistent in their opposition to what was seen as the more neoliberal direction of New Labour. So they voted against things like foundation hospitals, against some of the New Labour education reforms, against Tony Blair's welfare reforms, of course, against the Iraq War, and so on. In 2007, the Socialist Campaign Group tried to nominate a candidate to go against Gordon Brown when Tony Blair resigned. And the candidate they wanted to go against Brown was a chap called John McDonnell. And John McDonnell failed to reach the threshold of MPs' nominations because the Socialist Campaign Group was not large enough on its own, and you needed other MPs who were not in the campaign group to give their nominating votes. McDonnell failed to do that. In 2010, they put forward Diane Abbott, and it looked like initially she was not going to make it. And then at the last minute, a group of MPs who were not her supporters, but thought it was important to have someone like her on the ballot, gave her their votes. And of course, one of those was David Miliband, himself a candidate for the leadership, of course, nominating not himself, but an opponent, Diane Abbott. And part of that was cynical because I think he thought that Diane would take support away from Ed. But also, I think there was a view that it didn't look good that the Labour leadership contest was going to be all men. And then you had Diane Abbott, who was, of course, a woman and a woman of colour as well, standing. In 2015, I think that there was that memory of the Diane Abbott nomination where a group of MPs thought, well, that was fine having Diane there. In fact, it was useful for the left of the party to feel that there was someone representing them. We will lend our votes to the campaign group's nominee. And so the campaign group went around, and I think that literally they had a meeting where they sat around in a circle and went around and said, whose turn is it now? And McDonnell said, well, I've already tried and failed. Diane tried and failed. There was some question as to whether Michael Meacher should put his name forward, I think, but Meacher was quite elderly at the time. In fact, he died later that year, so just as well they didn't put him forward. And then so they looked at Jeremy Corbyn and said, Jeremy, why don't you do it? And so Jeremy said, oh, all right, yeah, fine, put my name forward.
It's really striking because it's basically Buggin's turn. That's how Jeremy Corbyn ends up being a candidate in this leadership election. Like you say, they've tried McDonnell, they've tried Abbott. He's just the next person on the list who's willing to say yes, and looks like he's in good enough shape to say yes. But something is clearly different in 2015. You've mentioned the thing that's the same, and it's this, in my view, fairly naive view that a lot of Labour MPs had. I remember the term or the phrase broaden the debate being used a lot around this time about why people were nominating somebody they didn't actually support. Because on the face of it, that's a rather odd thing to do. If you support somebody, nominate them, so vote for them from a very early stage. But there was this imperative to broaden the debate, just like they had in 2010. But clearly something had, but whilst that was the same, clearly things had changed since 2010 as well. There's the process, as you've discussed, but there's also the appetite among the people who are going to decide this election contest to pick somebody who is radically different from what has come before. And I wonder if, given, of course, we all know from the question that's at the title of this podcast and just from our memory of the last 10 years or so in British politics, we all know the way this ends. Given that, do you think there is something different about 2015 that means this is a much better time for the candidate of the Socialist Campaign Group to really capture the imagination of Labour members and registered supporters and trade union affiliates? That means that whoever the Socialist Campaign Group put up would have done much, much better this time and potentially won the Labour leadership. Or is there something about Jeremy Corbyn, this person who every Labour leader since 1983, when he first got into Parliament, thought wasn't really up to much, thought wasn't somebody who they should really try and promote and elevate within the party? Was there something about him that all of them had missed? And actually, he was somebody who was capable of winning this internal election and really attracting some could say cult-like following, some would actually be more complimentary and say a mass movement behind him that could propel him to the top of his party?
It's a very good question, and I think there are two parts to it. So the first is that I think that the reformers in the Labour Party under the Miliband years made their reforms based on fundamentally wrong assumptions. They assumed, looking at the 2010 leadership election, where David had won the member vote, that the Labour membership tended to be more on the right of the party. They also made an assumption, which turned out to be catastrophically wrong, that registered supporters would be even further to the right. And the view there was that people who support Labour but aren't enthusiastic enough to join as members must not be that left wing, right? They must be sort of fairly centrist. They lean towards Labour, but they don't feel passionately enough about democratic socialism to join a democratic socialist party. So those turned out to be both catastrophic misjudgments. And actually, as someone who was a member throughout all that period, it was obvious to me that the Labour membership were not enthusiasts by and large for New Labour. They saw it as almost by the end of the Labour government, they saw it as a necessary evil to win elections, but they didn't see it as something they truly believed in. Labour members, certainly by the 2010s, were of the view that the Iraq War was not just a mistake, but was, for many of them, was a series of war crimes, right? And I'm not saying that my circles were particularly representative, but I was a graduate student at Oxford at the time, and the Oxford University Labour Club passed a motion in this May-June 2015 period, instructing our local MP, Andrew Smith, who had been Chief Secretary of the Treasury under the Blair government when Gordon Brown was Chancellor, someone who was a Brownite, someone with a New Labour kind of class, to nominate Jeremy Corbyn. And actually, Andrew did. And he was one of the crucial final MPs in the final few minutes who dramatically signed the nomination papers that gave Jeremy Corbyn that crucial 12.5% of the Labour of the Labour MPs. So I think the ground had shifted, and the people who had changed the party rules hadn't realised that they were actually making it much easier for the left of the party and the left of politics to make their to give their input.
So in many ways, the MP's nomination stage is the critical moment of gatekeeping for the centre and the right of the party to keep somebody from the socialist wing of Labour out. And in fact, in this naive way that we've discussed around broadening the debate, they basically surrender their key moment of power and influence in the process to benevolently put Jeremy Corbyn on the ballot.
Yes, because if the MPs had stayed in the Electoral College and had voted as a bloc, let's say 80 to 90% of MPs had voted against Corbyn under the Electoral College system. I haven't done the specific calculations, but I think there's a very good chance that Corbyn could have been stopped becoming leader. And I think particularly in 2016, actually, Corbyn would have lost the leadership challenge that Owen Smith made against him had the Electoral College system remained in place. By that point, the MPs would have coordinated, I think, very strongly against him, and actually possibly within the union vote to an extent as well. But you also asked Lee about whether there's something very special about Jeremy Corbyn. And I think there might be, because at the same time that Labour members are voting for a leader in the summer of 2015, Labour members in London are also voting under the same rule system to select a candidate for mayor of London. And in that process, the Socialist Campaign Group get a candidate on the ballot, someone called Diane Abbott, and she loses the London mayoral selection to a candidate who was more of the sort of Andy Burnham soft left wing of the party, a chap called Sadiq Khan. So you could either conclude from this that there's something particularly toxic about Diane Abbott as a candidate, which prevents members of the party from voting for her. And some people would say maybe this is about race and gender. Some people would say it may be something about her communication abilities. Or you could take a more positive view on it and say there's something about Jeremy Corbyn that enthused and inspired Labour members to vote for him.
If I think about my recollection of this time and these events, one of the things that really stands out in my mind as helping Jeremy Corbyn is the fact that of the candidates that we've discussed standing for the Labour leadership, he is the only one who is not bound by the collective responsibility of being in the shadow cabinet. So he is a backbencher. He's always been a backbencher since he first got into Parliament. And this basically means that he can say and do whatever it is that he feels he needs to say and do in order to win the Labour leadership. He's also fortunate in the sense that he can say and do what he actually really thinks. And what he happens to think is, for reasons that you've explained, quite likely to appeal more than it may have done in the past to the people who will decide this contest. The other people, Kendall, Burnham and Cooper, are all on the Labour front bench. So they are bound, unless they want to resign from that position, to follow what is the leadership position of Labour at the time. Now, what's really curious about this is it's not Ed Miliband, who was leader of the Labour Party, of course, for the last 5 years, who is determining what that collective position is going to be. It's Harriet Harman, because she is the deputy leader of the Labour Party, had been under Gordon Brown, continued in that position under Ed Miliband. And because Ed Miliband vacates the scene with as much speed as he possibly can after the 2015 general election result, she is the one who is then temporarily catapulted into the position of acting Labour leader. And there's a particular vote, Richard, you'll remember the details of this much better than I do, on Conservative proposals about welfare, where she sets the Labour whip, or Labour certainly sets the whip on its front bench as being to abstain. What happened there, and how important do you think it is in this story?
Yeah, so it was an absolute dereliction of duty on Ed Miliband's part, one of his many catastrophic mistakes that he made as Labour leader, to resign as soon as Labour lost that election. Now, some people say, well, 5 years earlier, Gordon Brown resigned, but actually Gordon Brown resigned as Labour leader in order to try to bring about a Labour government. We've done an episode about the formation of the coalition government, and Brown, in effect, sacrificed himself. He said, I'm going to resign as Labour leader in order to try to use that as a bargaining chip to persuade the Lib Dems to go into coalition with Labour, where I'm not going to stay on beyond a caretaker role as Prime Minister. Miliband didn't need to resign, and other Labour leaders, after defeats, stayed on until their successor was elected. In fact, that was really, typically speaking, standard procedure. For example, we talked about recently, Jim Callaghan actually stayed on as Labour leader for a year and a half before his successor was chosen. But it would have also been perfectly fine for Miliband to say after the election, I'm going to resign as Labour leader, but I'll stay on as leader until the day that my successor is chosen. But basically, I think he couldn't deal with the emotional cost of having to do that. And so he cut and run, a bit like his brother did when his brother went to America after it was clear he wasn't going to be leader. And I think that was pretty shameful. So yes, Harriet Harman was in charge. Harriet Harman is not one of my favourite Labour politicians, I have to say. I think the two times that she served as acting leader of the Labour Party, in that summer when Gordon Brown had resigned and that summer when Ed Miliband had resigned, were both political catastrophes for the Labour Party. And in 2015, that showed itself in the context of a summer vote just before Parliament went into recess over welfare cuts. Now, listeners also need to remember that 2015 is the first time that there's been a majority Conservative election victory since 1992. The Lib Dems lose their seats, the Conservatives come in, and now you're going to get full-throated Cameron, Osborne, Thatcherite, hard right economics. And so they come in and say, we're going to cut the welfare bill. We're going to cut billions from the welfare bill. And we're going to please the Conservative membership who have been waiting for a true blue Conservative party for some time. And Harriet Harman's analysis of why Labour lost the 2015 election was that although Labour had basically not pledged to reverse Conservative austerity, and that Ed Balls, the Shadow Chancellor, had taken a very fiscally cautious line as Shadow Chancellor, Harman's view was Labour hadn't gone far enough on that. And to be so-called economically credible with the electorate, Labour needed to show that it was willing to really go even further on supporting austerity and cuts. And so she led the shadow cabinet to take the view, which would be the whipped position of the Labour parliamentary party in the summer of 2015, that Labour would not vote against those billions of pounds of Conservative cuts to welfare. And so, as you say, Lee, Andy Burnham, Yvette Cooper, and Liz Kendall were required under collective shadow cabinet responsibility to abstain on those welfare cuts. Whereas, dear Jeremy Corbyn, the perennial backbencher, someone who had never held a front bench position in the entire time he'd been an MP, and he'd been elected in 1983, he's now one of the very, very longest serving MPs in Parliament. And even at that time, he had served longer than most MPs by quite some measure. Corbyn could vote against, speak against, campaign against it. And as we've seen in the last year, Labour members don't like cuts to welfare. And so this was an opportunity for Corbyn to put clear blue water or clear red water between him and the other candidates. And the person this particularly damaged was Andy Burnham, who had positioned himself to be the candidate of the sort of left of centre of the Labour Party, where most of the Labour membership was located. And now he was seen as a sellout for a right-wing austerity agenda, and Jeremy Corbyn was able to speak against it, thanks to Harriet Harman.
I've always thought Harriet Harman is one of the least self-aware politicians we have in this country. So it's not a great shock necessarily to know that her judgment may have been wanting and that she may have brought about a series of events that were really not to her liking.
Which she never mentions in her memoirs. These memoirs that get all kinds of plaudits and so on. I read the memoirs. She doesn't talk about her role in the welfare vote. It's absolutely extraordinary, actually.
Well, that would be further evidence for the lack of self-awareness, I suppose. Thinking back to this period, I remember being very struck by the fallout from that welfare vote in particular. And it was part of a pattern where really Jeremy Corbyn seemed to be the only one of the leadership candidates who was really saying or doing something interesting in his bid to become Labour leader. And I say that as somebody who this was clearly not intended to appeal to, but there was clearly something much more interesting about him. Part of it I've always suspected was that Kendall, Cooper and Burnham all appear to be steeped in this quite bland version of hyper-professionalised politics in the style that New Labour and the New Labour experience of Tony Blair in particular had convinced a lot of serious people was necessary if you were ever going to be elected into government. But of course, a leadership election isn't about trying to appeal to the country at large. It's about trying to appeal to a selectorate, these people who have chosen to be empowered by paying £3 or their membership fee or by being in the trade union or whatever, to be able to decide this contest. And it seems to me, looking back on it, that Corbyn was the only one who really realised that this wasn't about appealing to the mass electorate. It was about appealing to a selectorate of people empowered to decide this election. It's always tricky when looking back at these events not to reflect on them with the knowledge of what was to come. But the other thing that I always also remember being really striking at this time is a sense of genuine, organic interest and support for Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, I had some friends at this time who signed up to be registered supporters just so they could vote for him. They had probably voted Labour in the past, but they were so enthused by him that they thought, yes, I actually want to help this man get over the line and become Labour leader. His events didn't really need to be stage managed to look like they were busy and there was enthusiasm for him. That was naturally there. People were genuinely enthusiastic for him. Now, the caveat, of course, to this is that being able to put on big events and looking like you're getting mass engagement isn't necessarily a precursor ultimately to success. People are right to have an eye on what is going to happen in the future when you have to appeal to the wider electorate at large. To paraphrase a Labour MP in the 1980s speaking about Michael Foot, there might be 10,000 people in a room all chanting your name, but it's no use if there are 100,000 people outside and they all think you're crackers. It's not necessarily going to win you an election in the longer term. But there does also seem to be this feeling around Corbyn of Labour becoming, or having the potential to be, a mass membership party again, where more and more people are feeling engaged with what the party is doing and engaged with his style of politics.
Well, also what Corbyn had was authenticity, which is one of the most important ingredients in politics. I think particularly since the MP's expenses scandal, when people are very cynical about politicians and they see that, or they think that politicians are out there to enrich and advance themselves at the expense of the public. And what Jeremy Corbyn could say was that all throughout his political career, he was someone who, he hadn't been caught up in the MP's expenses scandal, particularly, if I remember correctly, but he'd also taken positions at various times which were not to his immediate political favour, particularly from the perspective of the Labour leadership, but he took them because he thought they were the right thing to do. The welfare vote symbolised that. But some people who defend Harriet Harman have said to me, well, actually, Corbyn was already rising before the welfare vote. And that's true. That's true. By the time that the welfare vote was happening, polls were showing that Corbyn and Burnham were basically fairly level pegging. So that was a remarkable rise for Corbyn before the welfare vote. And then after the welfare vote, Burnham sinks down, Corbyn takes over, and then the polling shows for the rest of the contest that Corbyn has fairly plain sailing. But actually the issue before the welfare vote that helped to establish Corbyn's candidacy was the Iraq War. because Andy Burnham, the supposed candidate of the left, had voted for the Iraq War. You talked about how long Andy Burnham's been around. You're talking about him standing in 15 and 10 for leader. Well, Burnham was first elected an MP in 2001. So he was in Parliament in 2002 and 2003 and voted for the Iraq War because, I think, he was an ambitious young MP. And at that time, if you wanted to be an ambitious young MP and you wanted to get into the front bench, and the way you could do that and win favour with the Labour leadership, i.e. with Tony Blair, is to stand with Mr. Blair in Mr. Blair's war and his invasion of Iraq. Jeremy Corbyn, who had opposed pretty much every invasion or intervention, he'd helped found the Stop the War Coalition, which was not actually about the 2003 Iraq War. It was actually about the Persian Gulf War and the first Iraq War. He was opposed to that as well. So Corbyn had consistency on that. And in 2015, the Labour membership, which, as I argue, had always seen itself as sort of on the left of centre, the soft left of the Labour Party, as people might call it, thought, well, we've got two candidates who profess to be on the left of centre of the Labour Party, Mr. Burnham and Mr. Corbyn. But is Burnham the real deal? If he's voting this way on the welfare reform, he voted for the Iraq War, and here you've got Jeremy Corbyn, who speaks truth to power, both when it suits him and when it's also against him in terms of his own career advancement. And so I think that's a really special ingredient that helps explain the Corbyn success in the 2015 leadership election.
Okay, so all of the votes are cast. What is the outcome?
So it is a ranked choice voting system, an alternative vote system. So people can go 1, 2, 3, 4. As it happened, I was actually going to vote for Jeremy Corbyn as my first choice. And then I was basically bullied by the person I was in a relationship with at that time to not do that. And I switched my vote around. I was going to vote Corbyn 1 and Burnham 2. And instead I voted Burnham 1 and Corbyn 2. As it happened, it didn't matter because unlike in 2010, where the votes were transferred right through until the final round where you had two candidates, Jeremy Corbyn won on the first set of preferences. Now, all of the votes were in one pot. And so in terms of that total pot, Jeremy Corbyn won just under 60% of first preferences of that total pot. And the second place candidate, Andy Burnham, got just 19% of the votes. So there's a huge chasm between the first place and the second place finisher. Yvette Cooper gets 17%, and dear old Liz Kendall gets just 4.5%. That 4.5% became something of a running joke on the wonderful BBC programme at that time, This Week, where Liz Kendall was a presenter. And she was a very kind of good presenter on that programme. Andrew Neil always used to call her 4.5% Liz. But if you delve down, the party did report the difference in the votes between party members, registered supporters, and affiliated supporters. And if the vote had just been the party members, then it would have gone to a second round. Because Jeremy Corbyn failed to get 50%. He got just under, he got 49.6% of the first preferences of party members. I don't think that would have changed the outcome, because after redistribution of preferences, either after the redistribution of Liz Kendall's preferences, or if that wasn't enough, then Yvette Cooper's preferences, I think Jeremy Corbyn would have pipped the 50% mark pretty quickly. But it shows that actually, who were the voters who gave Jeremy Corbyn that extra sense of momentum and I use that word in reference to the campaign group that supported Jeremy Corbyn, which was called Momentum, Corbyn won 83.8% of the registered supporters. Those people that Peter Hain and Rachel Reeves and the right wing of the Labour Party set up in 2011, the people that they thought were further to the right than the Labour membership, but it turned out these people were further to the left of the Labour membership. And the reason they hadn't joined Labour was not because they thought Labour was too left-wing, it was because they thought Labour was too right-wing, but they exercised their franchise and gave Jeremy Corbyn an enormous cushion in his selection as Labour leader.
It's a staggering margin of victory that he manages to achieve almost 60% of first preferences. I mean, it's really remarkable. But one of the things that we've occasionally spoken about on this podcast before is about how difficult it can be to lead a party when you don't have the support of your MPs, and how generally problematic it is to have a system of election for the leader where the people who choose the leader and the people who can remove the leader, at least ultimately and in theory, with us being a parliamentary democracy centred around the House of Commons, are different. And what clearly happens here is that the members and the registered supporters and the affiliates are able to impose on members of parliament a leader who the majority of MPs do not wish to support.
And also, in this contest, the registered supporters plus affiliated supporters vote was more than the total votes of party members. So Miliband's great reforms of weakening the unions and the left of the party, people on the left, actually swamped the membership vote.
It's something that, of course, has happened in the Conservative Party twice, with the election of Ian Duncan-Smith in 2001 and the election of Liz Truss in 2022. Both of these were candidates who came second among members of parliament, and yet the membership imposed them on the party as their leader, and MPs had to try and make their peace with that until they couldn't, and in both cases they were removed before they could fight general elections. That wasn't the case in Labour with Jeremy Corbyn. Of course, he would ultimately fight 2 general elections, and I think in part that is a sense of luck and also a little bit of the misjudgment of others that helped put Corbyn in that position. Of course, the next general election would come just 2 years later in 2017, when Theresa May called that snap election. Her own failings, I think it's fair to say, as a campaigner, were exposed. And also Jeremy Corbyn did tap into this mood that I think was really widely unexpected, certainly among Conservatives, I think also among a lot of the mainstream people within the Labour Party, in which he managed to increase Labour's vote share to 40% and therefore managed to stay on afterwards, and had this sense of, people forget now about the 2017 election. It was a remarkable performance, what Jeremy Corbyn managed to achieve in terms of the vote share that he got and the number of votes that he got. The other person who performed remarkably in that contest was, in fact, Theresa May, who increased the Conservative vote share by 5%. But it was this extraordinary performance by Corbyn that means that the fact that she increases the Conservative vote share basically adds up to less than naught, and she ends up losing seats and losing the Conservative majority because Corbyn does so well. So there's this interesting thing that's going on in the years that follow, where the MPs don't really like him. You mentioned that there was this attempt to try and remove him in 2016, but he wins anyway. In fact, he wins on a greater vote share than he managed to get in 2015. It really backfires on the MPs trying to remove him. And then the 2017 election overperformance means he stays on until 2019, where, of course, he suffers a much more brutal rejection at the hands of the voters, and Boris Johnson wins a significant Conservative majority. And the reason I mention all of that is that there was a period of time between 2015 and 2019 when the Labour left, and this is really the Labour left. These are Bennites, in effect, thinking back to the 1980s. These aren't just slightly redder versions of the pink of New Labour. This is a proper left-wing Labour leadership. This period of time, they feel like they're in charge. They're doing very well in lots of the internal elections. Attempts to remove Corbyn have floundered and been an ultimate embarrassment, like in 2016. And looking back at it from the position of 2025, it feels remarkable, A, that that was possible, and B, that that was so recent. Now Jeremy Corbyn does not sit as a Labour MP. He was elected as an independent in his constituency. Keir Starmer has done everything he possibly can to force out not just the left of the party, but even bits of the soft left of the party have basically been made to feel unwelcome. It's become a hostile party for them to be members of. And so it's easy to think that these events speak to a really short, brief, particular period of time that cannot be found in our politics today and feels really alien from what the Labour Party looks like today. So, Richard, I guess to wrap this podcast up, I wonder what your reflections are on some of the comments I've made there, and whether or not you think this is just a freak period of time that our politics today and Keir Starmer's leadership today and the Labour Party today are totally detached from, or whether or not these events, these remarkable events, where Jeremy Corbyn takes the Labour crown, right? He wouldn't like the idea of calling it a crown as an anti-monarchist himself, but where he seizes the Labour leadership, have a legacy in today's politics.
I have two concluding reflections. The first is that these events underscored to me that there are many people who are in senior roles in my party, in the Labour Party, but I'm sure it's true in others, who don't understand political institutions, don't understand constitutional rules, and don't understand the potential for unintended consequences from changes to rules, institutions, constitutional structures. And a lot of what happened fundamentally went against the wishes of the very people who brought in the reforms. And they should have foreseen some of this, or they should have foreseen that it was a possibility. And either through a degree of myopia or arrogance or just misunderstanding, they set up a rule structure which enabled something that was totally unimaginable in the Labour Party, really in its entire history, that someone like Jeremy Corbyn, on the furthest left edges of the party, would be able to take control of the membership. Now, for some people, it's a great thing that they made those mistakes, but fundamentally they were mistakes that led to this. And I analogize it with constitutional reform, where I think a lot of people in the Labour Party advocate for various constitutional reforms that sound nice, that can be packaged up as democratizing and making things all nice and cuddly. I'm thinking of proportional representation or an elected House of Lords, or all of the various fashions that people on the left of centre-left of politics think are really jolly good ideas. And they don't realize that they are actually potentially setting up a set of rules that could empower their political enemies. And it could be a lot worse than the system they have at the moment, even if the system they have at the moment is not perfect. My second observation is that the rules of the Labour Party have not fundamentally changed. Keir Starmer did increase the nomination threshold from 12.5% to 20%, but he otherwise has left the Miliband rule structure in place. And in 2020, he managed to win that election by basically pretending to be a left-wing candidate, and benefited from the fact that the candidate of the Socialist Campaign Group, Rebecca Long-Bailey, was, I'm afraid to say, I'm sure she's a nice person, not up to it. Was just not a strong candidate. Next time there's a leadership election, one presumes now that the nomination threshold is taken more seriously. But if there is a candidate who can get that 20% of the Parliamentary Labour Party, they could be imposed on the remaining 80% of MPs, not just by Labour members, but also by the union affiliates. So actually, one other change has been the registered supporters has been taken out. But the union affiliates are still there. And they are much more numerous if they choose to turn out. And so there you could have, as a result, ironically, of rules that Ed Miliband brought in, which were meant to be about weakening the position of the Labour affiliated unions, a rule system which now makes it much easier for the Labour affiliated unions to pick future Labour leaders. So watch this space.
Absolutely. We finish as ever with a discussion of the books that we're reading at the moment. I'll go first. I'm currently reading this book called Scandal in Königsberg by Christopher Clark, which is a very short book, which focuses in on a few remarkable years between 1835 and 1842 in the small East Prussian city of Königsberg. If you've heard of it at all, it's probably because it's associated with Immanuel Kant, the philosopher who lived and worked there for most of his life. It's a very interesting book that looks at different opinions on theology, and Protestant theology in particular, in the early 19th century, and how different charismatic preachers managed to earn followings for what were some pretty eccentric and pretty biblically and physically unjustifiable approaches to understanding the world around us and understanding the Christian faith, and the way in which they had distorting effects on their local religious organizations and also on the societies of which they were a part, and how people dealt and handled those. There is more in this book, I'll be honest, about the theology of it and some of the people who were writing and thinking about it than I really expected. When I saw that it was a scandal, I expected a little bit more about outrageous conduct and the way in which the authorities tried to deal with that and suppress it than there has been, certainly so far, but maybe that is all to come. The challenge with reading it in truth is that a lot of the names are not names that will be familiar to most readers. I think they certainly weren't to me. And they're also very often names that are German. So it can be a little bit more difficult to get the pronunciation right in your head and to make a note of who they are. But it's a book you can read in just a couple of sittings, and I think it's very well done and well put together. Richard, what are you reading at the moment?
This week I read The House of Lords by John Wells. John Wells was a British satirist. He wrote for many years for Private Eye. He had a column in Private Eye called Mrs. Wilson's Diaries, which was a satire of the relationship of Harold and Mary Wilson from this kind of imagined diary of Mary Wilson, the wife of the Prime Minister. And then he had a sort of encore where he had a series of columns called Dear Bill, which were letters allegedly from Dennis Thatcher, but were also figments of his imagination. He was a sort of anti-establishment person who loved poking holes in pretension, but I think also had something of a streak of affection for those very institutions that he used to poke fun at. And this book, The House of Lords, is very much in that spirit. It is presented as a history of the House of Lords, and I read it expecting it to be a fairly straightforward history. Instead, it's mostly a book of anecdotes about the absurdities of the House of Lords at various different points and various scandals. It's very patchy, therefore, in its sort of full coverage of the history of the Lords, and there are quite interesting aspects of the history of the House of Lords that are left out, whereas there are whole chapters devoted to what I would regard as fairly minor scandals about the paternity of potential paternity of hereditary peers and things like that. So I wouldn't recommend it if you're looking to educate yourself on the history of the House of Lords, but if you are interested in history and are looking for a bit of light relief through the prism of institutional history, then maybe this book is for you. It was published in 1997. It was the last book that John Wells wrote. He died a few months after it came out.
We'll have links to the chosen books in our show notes, but that's all from us this week. Just a couple of quick reminders. One, that the podcast is now available on YouTube. So if you search for St. Attlee and Churchill there, you can watch recordings of our latest podcast. And secondly, that if you enjoy listening to the St. Attlee and Churchill podcast, we'd be really grateful if you could leave us a positive review wherever it is you get your podcasts from. We'll be back on Wednesday with our next instalment of Matters of Interest, and then next Sunday with our first in the new mini-series on the Heath versus Wilson elections. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.